So, the history of CivMC. Since 2022, CivMC has been the main primary server for the CivCraft genre. But of course, it's not the first CivCraft server. In fact, it is the latest in a very long line spanning more than a decade back. And so, in my goal to try and recap some of the key events of CivMC in this little series, I wanted to first put a little, almost like an introductionary video of a brief history of CivCraft. Now, originally this was going to be like a 3 minute video just explaining what CivCraft is, but then I got more into it and I was kind of procrastinating studying my finals, so this is what you got out of it. If you're not interested in the CivCraft history, you can just wait until the other parts in this series are released, which will focus solely on CivMC. But to explain the start of CivCraft, CivCraft was started in 2012 by a player called TTK2. In 2011, which was the year Minecraft officially released and started doing multiplayer stuff, he had started ANCAP Minecraft, which is often called a proto Civ server. It lacked the key plugins that CivCraft is defined by now, and it had more rules, like you can get banned for killing too many players. But it had a similar goal as CivCraft. And then in 2012, he launched the CivCraft 1.0 server with a goal, quote, I wanted to see a game where players' actions really mattered, where they created and shaped the societies and worlds they played in, a game that truly had no script. Now, working off of his prior server, he innovated a lot with new features and rules. One of the most important things was the new hands-off moderator approach. You can see those four rules were the most basic and only rules the mods tried to enforce. You couldn't cheat, you couldn't dox, you couldn't help ban players, and that was pretty much it. Besides that, it was all up to you. He introduced bastions, which are a feature where basically you can't. Civ doesn't use towny like something like Stoneworks does, but bastions almost have a similar effect where if you place on a bastion, you can't place any blocks, or I think destroy blocks if I'm not wrong on that one, within the bastion's radius, which helps you protect things. There was Prison Pearl, which lets you imprison players who you kill in a pearl and keep them trapped there as long as you pay a maintenance fee, which sort of simulated deaths or like keeping players accountable. There was factories, which helped you produce things at a higher scale and helped create a complicated economy. There were snitches, which obviously most of us can't play Civ 24/7. There are some exceptions who I won't name, but for most of us we can't. Snitches basically help you keep track where when you log on, you can check and see that, oh my god, at 1 a.m., Greggy crossed my server. Dear God, what do I do? Then there's Citadel and Name Layer. These basically let you reinforce blocks. So if you reinforce something with stone, it'll last like 50 hits until it's actually broken. And then Name Layer is sort of a goes hand in hand with that, where you can create a name layer where multiple players can reinforce something to the same group, which helps create a sense of community. And finally, he introduced realistic biomes, which basically incentivize trade or like even conquest because different biomes could only grow different things. Now, from the start, this always ended up being a political simulation esque concept, as you can see from the advertisement poster on the left from I think 2016 at the end of the server. It was using the political compass to advertise itself. On the right, you could see a bunch of countries would eventually bounce up and exist there. And it also has to be acknowledged just what a longevity the original CivCraft run had. TTK2 ran these servers from when he was in high school until he was in college over a span of 5 years from 2012 to 2016. CivCraft 2.0 in particular to this day remains one of the longest running servers. It ran across 3 years, and another sign of its popularity and success was the spin-offs. In the north there you can see Sovereignty Ascending, to the right is Civ Devoted, to the bottom I think, oh god, maybe Civ Experiment, to the left is the Civ Realm, something like that. Maybe I got them mixed up. But basically, a bunch of sideline spin off servers emerged and existed in the orbit of CivCraft 2.0, which basically shows what a success it was because not only was it able to create a player base from itself, it was able to create such a player base that demand grew for more than just a one mainline server. But of course, it wasn't all perfect. There were problems eventually. CivCraft 2.0 was taken down in early 2016, and there's a 6 month wait until CivCraft 3.0 came out. The devs launched a test feature to test new, or a test server to test new features and new ideas. And during this time, some players migrated to a spin off server called Devoted 2.0, or some of the other servers that existed in this time. When CivCraft 3.0 finally came live in July, it had some problems. There was an unpopular and poorly implemented shard system. Basically, shards split the world up into multiple differently loaded areas, which was supposed to help with lag, but a lot of the shards were labeled as unplayable or uninhabitable, and it wasn't that well implemented or well liked. There were pylons, which were a new way to make XP, and they needed more maintenance, which annoyed some players because they were kind of needy and a hassle. And then TTK3 purposefully made the gameplay more grindy and harsh. There's a much higher sort of curve to actually get good gear, and it was definitely harder to survive from all the sources I could find. And basically, while this was interesting and the ideas it could hold, it obviously alienated some players who wanted a more casual experience. And ultimately, all these factors kind of culminated into having a player count which wasn't where TTK3 wanted, especially where some players eventually began migrating servers. So on October 1st, 2016, TTK2 made a post on Reddit announcing his retirement. He said, quote, "In my mind, the experiment is complete. I have learned all that I will, and I have seen it through not quite to the end, but until I saw the top of the last hill with enough detail to satisfy me." And his announcement kind of kicked off a worrying spree where at the time the other Civ servers that we talked about were also going out, such as Experiment, Sovereignty Ascending, and the Civ Realm. The lone survival of these all, Civ Devoted, would be the one to succeed CivCraft, literally just because of process of elimination. And so what was originally a small sideline server became the main server of Civ. It had been started by a CivCraft player called Bonkill. Two versions had run from 2015 to 2016, with Devoted 3 launching a month before CivCraft 3.0 ended, and that effectively took over as the new mainline server of Civ and kept the genre going. Now, they had a pretty good foundation for the server. First of all, Bonkill and programmer Dan, the lead admins and owner, were well respected and well liked, and they had experienced Civ firsthand. They took more from CivCraft 2.0 than 3.0, which was the sort of standard, very successful experience that players liked compared to the more experimental 3.0, which ensured accessibility at a time where they had to, because of the other CivCraft servers had closed, they had to accommodate basically the whole community. But that's not to say they didn't experiment at all. They introduced hidden ore and obfuscation, which are now standard mechanics you'd see in any Civ server. And they were able to keep the Civ community united at a very key moment. In a different world, this could have literally just been the end of CivCraft, where just no one was able to keep it going. But the community didn't splinter, and they were able to unite it and keep it going at a very important time. But that's not to say it was perfect. A combination of factors made wards very common. There was cheap prop, but weak vaults and expensive bastions, which basically gave the offense an advantage over the defense. Pearls were expensive, and there were less banned PvPers than there had been on CivCraft. And this together made it harder for new players to become settled in, alienated the sort of more builders and build friends who weren't as keen on the PvP. Not to mention that some original players, even though Civ Devoted 3 had united the player base, still skipped out on it because it wasn't quite what they wanted from the CivCraft experience. All the constant wars gradually led to a burnout of the player base. Civ Classics 2.0 launched in June of 2017, which further took away some of the player base. The devs reset the map near the end, which once again lost a lot of the existing community that were still sticking with it, just because if there's another new server that's fresh and brand new, and the map on your existing server is already resetting, if you're already losing all of your sort of established builds and history, there's a lot less incentive to actually stick around, and so a lot of players did go to Civ Classics. The mods announced the end of the server on October 25th of 2017, quote, "We've spent long hours soul-searching, debating, trying to convince each other one way or the other, but that at the end of it, we've decided to begin the process of winding Devoted down. Devoted 3.0 will be ending soon, and we have no current plans for another iteration. Thank you for the commitment many of you have shown at the start, throughout, and now. Thank you." The mods announced the end of the server on October 25th of 2017. And it was definitely the transition from this one was less so picking up the pieces and more so passing on the torch. Just because Civ Classics 2.0 was a month old at this point, it was pretty obvious that it would be taking on the torch, and accordingly, Civ Classics 2.0 became the new entry. It had originally run for 2 weeks in 2016 as a response to CivCraft 3.0, which had been polarizing for its changes, and they came back with the new and improved second version in June of 2017. A lot of old friends came back to this one who had skipped on Devoted, as well as a lot of Devoted players. And when Devoted 3.0 shut down, Civ Classics would take the reins as the main Civ server. And this server was very successful. It was owned by Teal Nerd, a CivCraft 2.0 veteran who wanted to recreate that experience. It brought back some new features that Civ Devoted had introduced, like hidden ore, so it wasn't a complete refusal to accept the changes. But it did accept the popular elements that CivCraft 2.0 had, mainly like a more sort of casual experience compared to the grindy nature of 3.0, and it would become the longest lasting Civ server ever. It was so successful that a number of other servers popped up while Civ Classics was still around. The first one there you have is Civ Universe, which, if anyone is curious, was my first server. You have Civ Realms 2.0, which brought back the shard feature noticeably that 3.0 had tried to introduce. Civ Experiment came back with the 3.0, and even Civ Devoted came back a few years later with Civ Devoted Hell, which was a Civ server only in the Nether region. Civ Classic successfully maintained a very strong Civ player base. There were a lot of nations, a lot of players. It was very popular. But there was sort of an Achilles heel that would eventually bring the server down. And it was a lot of different factors, which none of which were particularly egregious on their own, but they culminated together, which were that the map was very large. It was 23K by 23K. For comparison, I think the Civ Devoted map was 10 by 10. Vaults had just gotten stronger and more advanced than ever. Just vault science had basically advanced and improved, and that had resulted in vaults becoming very strong, very big. Bastions were layered on for very dense bastion walls that made sieges very long. For example, to the right, you see the Lexington Siege of the Somber War, which we'll talk about in a second, which literally lasted 2 real life days, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. And because of the very large player base, that meant there were a lot of countries that could join wars and keep their going. And there are a lot of fighters. For example, in the Infinity War, it's generally split into 2 phases because during the second phase, a bunch of new players and new countries jumped in, which was just the fact that there were a lot of new players and countries that could be roped in. And all of this just resulted in very long wars. To clarify just how long, the Somber War lasted 6 months, which is very long in itself. There were 8 months of peace before the Infinity War, which lasted 1.5 years. So, for basically 3 years of playtime, 66% of that was taken up by massive server wide wars. And this basically resulted in a period of inactivity and burnout. A lot of countries were decimated, war infrastructure was gone, people were just tired, they lost interest. Some players had an exodus to Civ Realms 2.0, which had been going on for a few years at this point, but really experienced a resurgence with the boost of player base. But that server also fell apart after a mix of giant server killing wars, as well as the unpopularity of the admin Stonato, who had a few controversies of his own. Civ Classics 2.0 would come back and have a brief resurgence, but it never reached the same heights. Part of this is also just kind of an inevitability. I mean, the server had been going on for 4.5 years, and at a certain point, it's just kind of inevitable that players just kind of get done with it. And so it would end on December 18th of 2021. And the sort of change in this one is that there wasn't really a clear successor. When CivCraft ended, Devoted took over because it was literally the last one standing. When Devoted ended, it was obvious that Civ Classics would take over. But who would take over now that Classics was done? Civ Realms 2.0 would last until September of 2022, but it was already a few years old at this point. There had been a lot of controversies and conflict, and the player base was generally tired and burnt out of that server. Ascentius was a spin off server with towny elements that never took off, had its own controversies, and ended in January. CivRev existed, but it didn't really have mainline server energy. That I know that sounds stupid, but it was a lot more experimental, and usually there's one mainline Civ server that doesn't experiment too much and very much keeps the standard experience intact, which CivRev didn't do. Devoted Hell lasted until 2022, But just like CivRev, it was a spin-off. It was literally only in the Nether, so it definitely didn't have that mainline energy. And no clear successor would really emerge for 6 months until CivMC came out. CivMC launched in June of 2022 to provide that well-tested, well-liked CivCraft 2.0 slash Civ Classics experience, and it has been the mainline server ever since then for more than 2 years now. And it's had three was a typo. It's really had two key challenges that inherited from Civ Realms and from Civ Classics. The first was whether or not server killing wars would return, and the second was if they could sustain a player base. And if you want to find out if that's true, stay tuned for the first actual part of the series on the generic war. Thank you for watching. Just for clarification, the main sources I'm using are the CivWiki in general, and then a number of Reddit posts, which I'll have linked in the description. Thank you for watching.